So I'd like to welcome everybody to the July 10th meeting of the GLIMPRINT seminar series. We really are happy to have Jacob Barhak coming back to talk to us. He was one of the founders of this group and was very involved at the beginning. And it's great to see what he's been up to over the years since then. As always, I need to remind you that this meeting is live streamed and recorded on YouTube and is available in a slightly edited form for later viewing publicly. Helikar, myself, Jim Sluka, and Lorenzo are always available to take your comments and suggestions. Feel free to reach out to us if there's anything we can do better. We have a variety of communication channels, which would work better if people use them more. We've been trying to build a bit of a community through these channels. In particular, we have our old IMAG MSM wiki page. We have the YouTube channel, which is the archive of videos, and we have the GLIMPRINT page as well. Please reach out to us about any of these. If you want to share a publication, we can put it up on the IMAG site. Send that to Jim Sluka, and we'll make sure that you get the credit and the recognition that you want for that there. We can also do the same thing on the GLIMPRINT site. We can also on GLIMPRINT site post seminar, meeting announcements, workshop or class announcements, other publications, job openings, funding announcements, and so on. So help us generate content for that site. We'd really appreciate that. Coming up in October at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, there is the 2025 Combine meeting. That's a big meeting on model sharing and model standardization, very relevant to this community. Chi-Chi May is one of the organizers. She's spoken here in this seminar series multiple times. And so I definitely encourage you to participate in that. It'll be in Wisconsin again, so it's relatively easy for many of us to get to. The one after that's going to be in Auckland, and then the one after that's going to be in the UK. So if you're in the US, probably the October meeting is your best bet. Again, we're going to have a bit of a break for 3 sessions. That may change, of course, but at the moment, we're not planning on meeting during the dog days of the summer. And we'll start again on September 4th. As always, we are looking for your suggestions. Suggest yourself, suggest your graduate students or postdocs, even if you've spoken before. If you have updated material to present or a different topic that you'd like to present, we'd be happy to hear it again. If there are people who've written experimental papers, clinical papers, industrial papers that you find interesting, Lorenzo is very effective at getting people to come to speak to us. So the purpose here is to make sure that we have people that you want to hear. And so please don't be shy about suggesting people that you would like to have us put on the roster of speakers. Okay, today we have Jacob Barhak coming and talking to us about lessons learned from modeling COVID-19, steps to take at the next pandemic, bringing us back to our roots of this seminar series from 5 years ago. And I will turn the screen share over to you.
Okay, so as I said before, I rather have it more like a discussion, less like a seminar. The reason is because this is what me and some of my colleagues have seen so far, things we can learn from the last pandemic and what to do so the same bad things will not happen in the next pandemic. Now, a little bit of history. James mentioned it. We actually started the viral pandemics working group, and there were many people involved, and some people contributed a lot of stuff, but then little by little it dissipated. I continued the work on modeling COVID-19. I'm still working on it, but my computer is currently burned out, but it will get back soon, and I'll continue this because the idea is to actually comprehend what happened with COVID-19. I gave talks before about what I'm doing. We're going to mention some of them here, but this is not about the talk is not about my modeling in per se. It's about steps to do and not necessarily modelers. It can be government, it can be other entities, and what should they do so we as modelers can actually model properly the next time, because this time we, and I speak for myself, we didn't do the best job we could, uh, for many reasons, and we'll talk about those reasons now. Interestingly enough, the previous MSM IMAG meeting, the theme was lessons learned. However, I haven't seen too many talks about the lessons learned there. Perhaps it takes time to actually learn what we did wrong, and hopefully we're doing it now. So hopefully it will reach back to the IMAG people that will watch it and take notes. And this is what I see. I'm speaking on behalf of a group here, but what you hear are my opinions. I'm not, don't attribute my opinions to any of the people listed here. They just contributed to the paper, and what I'm talking about are my understandings of what it is. Um, I also want to mention John Rice. He was his name is not here, but he is one of the people who actually contributed most to this paper appearing, because he was asking me many times, like, what did we learn? Why will we do this? And eventually I started writing this paper, and now it's the preprint. There's also, I'll give the acknowledgements first. I don't want it, but there are many people who gave their time and effort, and a little bit of funding given for computing power that was given to support this work. So I don't want to miss it at the end. Many people, there are many more who are not even listed here that produced this work. But again, I'm speaking for myself, not for all of them. They just contributed and contributed quite a bit. So I'm responsible for whatever I'm saying, and I also have a conflict of interest. I have to declare I am working outside academia. I have patents in the theme of disease modeling. Therefore, I have something to gain by promoting some of the things I'm saying in this webinar. Uh, they're all declared here, even places where I get funding and so on. You can later check it out, and you can download this presentation using this QR code or the link before, and we can make it available for you. Or just send me an email, I'll make it available. And I also, where this talk came from, it came from a preprint. We still haven't published. If someone really has some good ideas and wants to join a publication, it's still possible because it still haven't reached the journal. It's a level of a preprint now. The preprint is available here, and we made sure that all our conversations are being recorded, and you can trace back our conversations in the Google Docs. So you can see who claimed what and what ideas fell through and what didn't go and what edits we made since the beginning of when we started writing the notes about this. Also, it was given in Midas. This talk hopefully will be slightly different because I want it to be a discussion. But um, since it's a long talk, I'm going to talk about only several of the aspects. We gave in this, basically the paper, we wrote a checklist for modelers, government, and everyone involved in modeling pandemic of what to do in the next pandemic, because apparently this checklist was missing in this pandemic. So we raise the problems and we show some solutions that are available. There are some things that are unavailable yet, and they are written in the infrastructure and education. This may be something we might want to discuss in a future meeting. So I'll try to cover the three elements of modeling: validation and information. Each one of them has, you see, simple words of what should we do. And then later we'll elaborate on why and how. So I'm going to touch on those. Um, if anyone wants to add more, we can later discuss about it. Or during now, if you see something you don't like, jump in. I'm okay with this being interrupted and we discuss. It's more important that we get the information, the full information out to whoever was going to do things in the next pandemic than, me quoting things or saying things. So the first thing that we need to do for the next pandemic, the first point that we failed on, was to record infections, hospitalization, and deaths per region. Well, people saw that there were graphs all the time on TV. However, there were many problems. Here, I in the data set that I used, there were examples of like the number of cumulative hospitalization was not monotonically increasing in time, which cannot be mathematically. So it's still, those errors exist. Or examples where current hospitalization is higher than the cumulative hospitalization. Those errors existed in data that existed, and people heard about mortality miscounting. We'll talk about it a little bit later. So, and this information came from multiple regions. Each modeler who modeled some region get data. Some of them got it from multiple locations. Some people gathered it from one source. Some went to and gathered it from multiple locations, but we didn't have it in one trusted source. It was awful, and it was not consistent also. Like numbers of infections basically were reported as number of tests. And tests vary in their accuracy and things like this. So more importantly, the hospitalizations and deaths, even those were not really consistent. I gave some examples of what happened with hospitalizations, but deaths themselves were debated by people whether they were reported correctly or not. Those two numbers are important because you can argue about the infection rate that you see by the number of tests, because the tests vary from location and they vary in accuracy and so on and so forth, and you don't test everyone. But hospitalization is something that should be recorded, because a person is hospitalized is easy to do, and you know he was hospitalized. And same as death. So those numbers are important for modeling purposes because those can be trusted. So those are important numbers to record that were not recorded properly. More than this, the information should be centralized in a trusted location. I got my data from the COVID tracking project. They were affiliated with a newspaper, The Atlantic, and they did good job. Actually, the best at that time when I started it, they were the best, and I looked at many places, and they did provide their data in multiple formats, such as CSV files, spreadsheets, HTML files. When I looked at PDFs that come from the World Health Organization, I couldn't extract the data. It was probably because, like, oh, the table was cut by this page. How do I extract it? I have to write a program. So the trusted sources didn't do as well as the volunteer organization, and that's a problem. We don't want in the next pandemic to be in the same situation. We want the governments to supply this information as best as possible, and it's fairly easy to do with today's tools. You just have to set up for this. Here, for example, there was a lack of standardization. Different regions reported positive tests. This was not enough. We actually need the prevalence or the probability, the amount of people in the population that have a disease, and this today can be counted by other means better than tests, such as wastewater metrics. This is still new, and not every state can do it, but little by little, the situation has to get to the point that we are able to get proper numbers and not rely on tests that vary and therefore not standardized and mess our numbers up. Otherwise, whatever we're seeing is questionable. And then specifically, I'm talking about infections, but other numbers also we have to standardize. So the second thing we need to collect, and something that was not collected, interestingly enough, in the viral pandemics working group, there was a talk by Alan Perelson who actually showed some of those, is infection curves. Those were not available at the beginning of the pandemic. Actually, in May 26th of May 2020, the Department of Homeland Security, this is 6 months after the pandemic started. 6 months later, the DHS was asking about the average infectious period during which individual can transmit the disease. By that time, there were lockdowns and people who were supposed to stay at home for a certain number of days if they got infected. How did we know how many number of days should a person stay at home if we don't know the infectiousness curve? That's a problem. We don't know. And the government, they actually, I have to give credit for the Department of Homeland Security here, because they had a very good document. It was called the Master Question List of about COVID-19. It's still available. You can check it out. And they published it regularly. And each time they wrote down all the things they know and the sources they got them from, and they wrote down what they need to know. And this is in May 26th, this was still something unanswered in May 2020. So this is something that we'll need to do. Now, those curves basically represent how much virus the person generates. Sometimes they're called generation curves, sometimes shedding curves, infectiousness profiles. People call them in different names. There might be slight differences even in definition, but the idea is to find out how much a person is infectious, and you have to know it since the start of the disease, like day zero. If someone gets infected, little by little they get more infectious, and then when they recover, they get less infectious. So we need to know those, and those will vary by individual. One thing we still don't have, and the closest is actually Alan Perelson, who actually gave a talk here in the Viral Pandemics Working Group. They have actually tested several of those curves, and they showed 5 of those. So you actually have some idea of distribution. But this should be done more properly, either by testing it somehow, or on different individuals and showing distribution, or later calculating it retroactively, like some people did. Robin Thompson, for example, or Lucas Botcher. The last 2 curves you see here are their calculations. You see they're fairly close to each other, and those are on average. But those things appeared very, very late generally. We need those at the beginning so we can model properly. So this is one thing that we will need. Um, one more thing that we need, which is we didn't really have, and it was hard to find, is to estimate the transmission rate per encounter. Whenever I get to a cab today, I have a very nice conversation I get with the cab driver, because many of them remember COVID and how they what it's all about. And I tell them what I do, and then I ask them, what's the chance, do you think, if you during COVID took someone for a ride for about 15 minutes and then dropped them off, what's the chance of you extracting COVID? I asked it not only cab drivers, but I asked it many people. People don't know. The first number they tell you is something like, oh, it's very high, 90%, 70%, 50%. Very few people lower it down. The correct number is about 2%. It's like, this is how much you calculate. If you do 70%, we'll all be sick in no time, and then we'll all recover, and that's it. Like, but this is not what was going on. The number, the disease propagated because we had encounters, and we were infectious for many days, and we encountered many people and gave it up. So we have to calculate the amount of per individual, per encounter with one person, because this is the number that people actually respond to. If you have an encounter, you want to know what's your chance of being, what's your risk actually. If they give you they give you the R naught number, then it doesn't mean anything to the individual. More than this, for modeling purposes, it's also very important. So this is why we need this number, and hopefully, I'm not sure. Do you see still my? Yeah, you see the presentation, because I'm not seeing it anymore. Okay, apologies. So this number can be modified later by places that are more dense, regional climate, ventilation, transportation hubs. Those will have effect and will modify this number, but we need those extracted. And this is something that we can potentially calculate somehow, and we need this. Now, more than this, multiple such formulas should be constructed by multiple modelers. This is a modeling exercise that later has to be done, because this will later allow us to actually figure out which is the correct transmission rate actually, and not whether the and perhaps because some of those numbers are very hard to calculate, so they're themselves an assumption kind of. Also, we have to look at the production number, the R naught in SIR models, is actually, some people say, oh, this is the closest thing that you can calculate to see how the spread of the disease is. But again, this is not per individual. This is for the entire population, and it shows you how many people will get infected eventually. Doesn't tell you when, doesn't tell you the probability. It takes into account the infectiousness curve, the transmission rate, and the number of encounters. All of those are bundled together in this differential equation. Now, take a step back, and I will ask you, still, sir, how many electrical appliances do you have in your house that are 100 years old? Anyone? Zero. Even 20 years old, think about it. Like something from the 90s, like a Discman, who and use are being used. Why are we using a 100-year-old equation to guide our modeling? We have better techniques now. So this R naught, and by the way, academics still write papers about it around the SIR model all the time, and some of them they can justify why they're doing it. Say, oh, this SIR model can help us deduce some things that other models cannot. Okay, I get that, but the majority of them today, at least the majority I saw, are variations of SIR, SEIR, SIR. It's time to get away from this. If we are doing research, we should get away from this and find other techniques. And by the way, SIR and other techniques may have some correlation between them. It's a nice way to get away from this. So we should use more powerful techniques and get away from this R naught and use an example like actually transmission rate per encounter and not the R naught that we had before. You can still calculate the R naught if you have all of those elements that I say, infectious, transmission rates, number of encounters. So you can go back, but not in this direction. Another thing we need is to estimate the encounter frequency, and this can be done per region. But the idea is encounter frequency. Some places people meet, go more to the street, and there are more encounters. Some places people stay at home, and the encounters are only between family members. We need to have some sort of estimate, and this is actually an important number, not only for diseases. This is something any department of statistics should have, and to find those numbers was actually very, very hard. I looked at many papers and found only some of them. Some people use contact matrices, but then they change from region to region, and it's easier, and of course they change with behavior. It's to consider the base of the pandemic, you need the number of encounters on average. How many people do you see a day? Just ask the Department of Statistics to actually issue a survey like this. How many people do you meet a day on a regular basis before the pandemic starts? This number alone will give information for multiple other economic things, not only pandemics. So it should be available. It's currently hard to find. Mobility data can modify this number, and fortunately during the pandemic multiple sources provided mobility data. I use Apple Mobility, other people use some other sources for mobility data. Google did, and there were some other things. The household size, fortunately Department of Statistics does publish this in the census. You can actually find it in the census, and you can find the household. So this is in any country almost that has a Department of Statistics. So this is good. Why do we need this number? Because during the pandemic, when you isolate a person, they get out of the pandemic. During isolation because they got infected. Typically, they meet their household people, so you know how many people they may infect, even in isolation. This is why this number is important. And of course, those are the people that they meet regularly also. So at least that number. So it's kind of a minimum that is important. Now, this is one more thing that was awful in this pandemic, but is very important. I'll mention Eric Ferguson from Montclair University. He actually did a study about this. And this is how local jurisdictions, what restrictions do they do? So he studied whether they have school closures, office shutdowns, restaurant restrictions, mask mandate, and mobility limitations. If any one of us would watch the news, they would know there are local ones, but those vary from one place to another. And he organized them. Today you can find him in his GitHub account. There's a spreadsheet that actually shows those. This was not available during the pandemic. This was work he done later on. I pressured him quite a bit. Eric, I apologize for pressuring you that much. He didn't get anything out of me other than grief and oh, this had to be done, this and this and this. Eventually, but he was able to do something that no one else did. And this is very important to have in the next pandemic, because think about it. We in the US, especially, we have the US Constitution. It starts with the words that we don't know how to govern, and therefore we're allowed to experiment. It's my paraphrasing, but this is how the Constitution starts. So if you are experimenting and each state has its own, or each local jurisdiction has its own rules, and we don't advertise those rules. So if we're making an experiment and we're not saying how the experiment was done, then what did we do? Later on, we cannot compare from one place to another. So all of this should be centralized. There was another source, a law firm actually went in and actually did those during the pandemic, but it was not in a way that modelers can use it. What Eric did was a very simple spreadsheet that I, as a modeler, can use it and apply it to US states. So this is something that the government should be able to do fairly easily. Just have a website that each state or each county or whatever writes down on this. There will be a table and say, oh, we impose this in this date and impose this restriction on that date, and even have comments and things we cannot. But we didn't have that. Later on, we learned about some things retroactively, and this is one of the most important lessons learned, because then we can actually follow what happened in the past and find out which things actually work better or worse. This will be valuable information even without modeling. So this is my understanding, and this is my recommendation. Perhaps the most important thing to do. So Eric Ferguson has stumbled on important things. Now, beyond that, we're able to, with this, we will be able to explain better the information. One more thing with it we didn't have. We want to estimate the mortality profile. And mortality profile is not only one thing, is not only the chance of dying according to age, which you see here, which CDC actually did publish, I think it was March. You can check me on this later, but they did publish the chance of dying out of COVID-19 by age. So you can see this graph. But they did not publish when will you die since infection. Why is this important? Because when you model, you also want to know when this person died if you want to compare it to the actual numbers. So if you don't know, like let's say I got infected and I know that the person will die, but when will they die? This is also important information, should be there. So not only the probability of death, but also time of death. And according to age is good enough, but you can have more variables such as sex or whatever, like comorbidities or whatever. The more data you have, the more modelers will be happy, but at least the time and probability. Interestingly enough, and this is again, viral pandemics working group was good here. They brought one of the talks was by Filippo Castiglione, who gave information about, he actually created a multi-scale model of when you die, and not only when you die is, not only probability of dying is when you die. His model went multi-scale by spread of the disease in the cells, then later in the organ, then later when does the individual dies out of it. So let me show you how it looks like. This is the CDC model, but this is how it looks like. So for each, you can see for each day there's this probability. So for someone who's like an infant, 0 days, this model produces some number, 0 years old, sorry. It says that your probability of dying is really, really, really low. At a certain date. In this case, it was day 16. Day 17 is different, and so on and so forth. But if your hedge is higher, then you can actually say your probability of dying in day 20 is about 1%. Now you can model. Now you can actually run simulations that will tell you more information. So we need to estimate the mortality profile, and this can be done either if you cannot do a function like a survival function. Functions are hard for modelers to actually, believe me or not, functions are hard to implement unless you have all the information about units and stuff like this. This is one of the things within the biopandemics working group. We actually published how hard it is to do this. But if you have it in tabular form or even interactive graphics with code, then yes, you can then reuse this. So you, this is about mortality profile. Um, Something that people debated a lot. All the numbers that we observed in the pandemic, to some degree, were wrong. First of all, there's statistical variation, but even the numbers, once reported, they were collected from many sources, and when bundled together, there were problems. So collection procedures were not consistent among places. There were multiple types of diagnostic tests that were used for, especially for infectiousness, to figure out who's positive and who's not, with varying degree of accuracy. And also, some procedures have difference in response time. Some places don't work over the weekend, and therefore on Monday you would see a spike. Some of those things have to be all standardized and reported in a continuous manner without problems. Um, Also, remember the number of positive tests does not scale to the number of infections in the population, which is actually what we're looking for. This is only a sample. So, to get the number of infection populations today, perhaps you can use wastewater metrics, but until then, we have to modify it. The modification people use today, it's about multiplied number of tests you have, that positive people, by 5, and then you'll have a good estimate, or 7 or 20. People come up with different numbers for that. So we need to estimate the reported numbers accuracy. So each number we disbelieve and say how accurate it is. This is the first thing. So also remember that there are delays in reporting for especially deaths. Like they like information came in a few days later sometimes. And also cause of death, and this is true not only for the pandemic, it's also true for clinical trials. The cause of death may not be always associated. Actually, in clinical trials, the numbers reported in each clinical trial, they have different definitions for how did the person die. So when you compare clinical trials, you cannot necessarily compare the numbers easily unless you have some sort of modification factor to to compensate, because differences in definition between the trials. Sometimes even if they are defined, sometimes it's ICD-9 or ICD-10, so different in definitions of how they use the codes to justify this or that condition. Even if they use the same name, it's sometimes problematic. So this, in modelers today have to find out inaccuracy in their numbers, especially if the data coming from multiple sources. Also, it's important to distinguish between the modeled numbers, which is the simulation runs inside the computer, which we can argue is ground truth for the computer, and the observed numbers, which is the numbers usually we collected and try to compare against or try to reach. Those are observed, and therefore the observer himself, they kind of you have to have a function to mitigate between the model numbers and the observed numbers. This is very important for modelers. I implemented it like halfway, I think a year after or something like this, a pandemic, because it just took time to implement and gather information from multiple sources. And also you have to investigate multiple correction strategies. You run the simulations like, okay, you assume the number of infections should be multiplied by 5 to get the correct number. Try it with a 7, try it with a 20, see how it changes the simulation. And in good places, sometimes the numbers themselves that you got are graded. Sometimes there is some standard deviation. Sometimes they actually gave a grade, like the COVID tracking project, they did a good job. And some places say, oh, we believe these numbers, we give it the score of A. Then we have someone place else who say, we don't believe those numbers, we've seen some problems, we gave it a score of C. Those things can be used in modeling. You can actually change the variation. So those are things that are important, and it's important to know that we need those because there's always wrong numbers, and people argue both ways. By the way, some people will say this is overestimated, something is underestimated. We need to figure out how, which is the correct one, and how do we do this? By validation. I have ensemble model technology. What I do is I just plug in all the models and see what the system tells me, and then it kind of I let them compete and collaborate, and then eventually I get an information that tries to explain what happened. So I'm trying to explain the pandemic by attempt to match the recorded numbers, those that were observed. It doesn't matter the source. I get the source of information, and I'm trying to run the simulations to match those numbers. In my case, it's the COVID tracking project. And one thing to understand, at the beginning of the pandemic, people came up and say, oh, if only you can show you can hit this number. And I was scratching my head because I know that models can't hit a number or this or that. Models are not for that. They're trying to explain what happened. You can perhaps hit one number, but then you won't get another number in a different state. It's very unlikely that you are able to explain things fully because the phenomena itself is stochastic. But you can get as close as you can with the tools that you do have and with the assumptions and knowledge that you do have. And this is the idea. So don't expect the models to be perfect. But the focus should be not on forecasting of the future, but it should be on trying to explain the things that you do see. Because if you can explain them, then perhaps you can forecast in the future. But currently, it's very hard to us even to explain COVID-19 5 years later. I'm not kidding. It's like we still haven't explained fully what we saw. So using ensemble modeling tools, you can attempt to verify, compare, construct assumptions that you made. You can also pinpoint errors in comprehension. Why can't we hit this number? There is a reason. What happened there? Maybe it's statistical variation, but at least we can see this. We can help improve comprehension over time, because if you continue doing it, and I've been doing it for 5 years, you learn that your first numbers may not be correct. So here's an example of what happened to me. I published first that the transmission rate per encounter was about 0.6%. I made a simulation of 3 months. I published it. This was a very base model, the first one I came up with, 0.6%. I was astounded by this number, but this is what the simulation told me. I was afraid almost to publish it. Later on, I found out, and also it shows me that the long infectious model was dominant. This was like the first simulations did that. But then I continued modeling, and I said, okay, we can't model for 3 months. We have to cut it down to 3 weeks and try to repeat the 3 weeks for each sample we have, like a sliding window over the data, and see what we get. Once I started doing this, numbers started stabilizing, and the profile, I learned much more. So now I can tell you the transmission rate per encounter was roughly 2%, actually a little bit lower, but 2% is good enough estimate. Wasn't that far from the 0.6%. It wasn't like 70% like people told you, but I learned this over time. It took me a while to get there. But if we have those tools readily available with the computing power and everything, and people concentrated this, we'll learn it much, much faster than what I learned. The mixture, I also learned that infectious models are better as a mixture, which makes sense because some people react differently to their infections curve. So not only the long one is dominant, the long one is there, but like there are other people who have shorter infections period. And finally, I found out even the temperature may have to do something as an important role in transmission. I'm not sure if it's transmission or behavior or something like this, but I can tell you that all colder states transmit much better. Transmission there is much better than warmer states. This would have been useful at the beginning of pandemic to know what's going on. Perhaps it would have changed some policy. I don't know. So for me, the experience I had modeling it, and I'm still haven't finished modeling. I'm still doing something. Is that it's very important to repeat simulations from different perspectives, adding models that you may not necessarily agree with to see what happens and whether they work or not, and can they explain or not. Proper explanation requires a lot of computing power. So far I counted throughout when I'm doing it for what, not only COVID, but throughout my simulations, I think I wrecked something like 7 or 8 computers. Wrecked meaning like really. By the way, my computer now is in repair because the motherboard has to change because it was working too hard for several months on one simulation. I kid you not. This is what's happening now. So uh, also, it's very important to separate assumptions slash models from the data. You still have to, if you believe or don't believe the data, this is not new data. This is an assumption, and you plug it in with the models, and you can collect as many of them as you can. And models are assumptions, they are not ground truths. When a model presents something, this is an assumption of what probably observed. And yes, you can try to draw conclusions with it, but for this you need a lot of simulations. And what I'm really trying to do is, we instead of trying to focus the future like everyone tried to do, the idea was to actually attempt to extract invariant disease parameters, such as transmission rate for this virus or infectiousness curve. Those are invariant, meaning they will not change by behavior of the people, because the change of behavior should affect the disease. When you have a state mandate that says something closure or not closure, this should affect the behavior, that should affect the spread. But the disease itself is infectious at the same rate. So we're trying to figure out how infectious it is. So it's possible to compute other things as well, but it's important to get the invariants first. R naught should be an invariant, but it's kind of too convoluted for people to comprehend. It's for scientists, not for the people in the street, if you understand what I'm saying. Also, and this is very important, here I assume people in the viral pandemic working group believe like me, that if we have all the numbers properly from the pandemic, meaning reported from the pandemic, then we should be able to compute things about the disease computationally. Anyone here disagrees? If we had all the numbers at the time and we had all the techniques and all the open source and everything accessible, we should be able to at least extract information about disease. Anyone agrees with me? Okay, this is a belief. We believe it as scientists. This has not been proven. We actually could not do this for 5 years. So it's important to understand that this is our ground hypothesis. We still need to prove it. I believe in it in all my heart. I've invested a lot of years of my life into this hypothesis, but I have to consider the fact that I may be wrong, and those numbers are meaningless. Always remember that we still have to prove it. Okay? Because as long as we don't prove it, we are not credible. And this has to stay in our minds, that we still have to prove it, and this should propagate forward. I believe in it in all my heart, but I cannot prove it yet. Hopefully someone can at some point by showing better results that I could. It's important to make resources available and accessible. There was a problem that's like numbers reported were not accessible to many people. Sometimes it was licensing issues, like Creative Commons Zero, which were recommended in multiple occasions, even here in the paper within Viral Pandemics Working Group, then is something that is not being used enough. The data out there, sometimes it's under all sorts of other licenses. Now, the licenses may not matter to people in academia that can claim for use, but if I don't have the correct license and I operate outside academia, I'm taking a risk. So why would I touch it? So why limit the ability to analyze, put it under a license I can use? There are some examples like papers that were by CC by NC, which is non-commercial use, meaning I can't use it. When I try to contact the people, well, they don't respond, so I can't use this data. So all of this should be done, especially there's a license called GPL, which is in industry, it's really problematic. I ask all of the academics, don't use GPL ever again. It's not good. It actually doesn't allow the information to flow despite all good intents. It was good for some things many years ago, but it's a license that haven't been touched for like 20 years. Do you have an electronic appliance that's 20 years that works after 20 years? No, the world moves on. Today with CC0, it's much better. Also, competition between players, which should be, it's okay. We all want to compete and publish and make some scoops, and we want to be first and get promoted and whatever. But it should not diminish the incentives for all players, as many players, to play in the modeling arena, because it will be good for everyone eventually. So open source tools should be made readily available. Good thing is this is happening, but again, try to pick licenses that are nicer, like CC0, MIT, BSD. Those are better, but even those cannot be mixed with some other licenses. So this is where I'm. This is why I'm saying what I'm saying. CC0 is nice with everything, so almost everything. Also, if everything can be centralized to improve accessibility, it will be beneficial in the future. I must give some good points to the Department for Homeland Security, who made the master question list document. This is very good source of knowledge. Despite the fact that they didn't know some things, they showed it and humbly said, "This is we know." Very good. I also give the Midas network. They actually gave a bunch of papers at the beginning and a bunch of resources. So they're supposed to do this. It's nice. Hopefully, in the biopandemics working group in the future. I know there was an attempt to do this, and we tried, but perhaps we weren't set up. It came up so quickly. Perhaps in the future we'll be able to do it properly. But these are the good things I said for those who actually did try to do it. We need to improve the measurement of hospitalization. This is Coyote. Coyote actually gave information about hospitalization for the model. I didn't have a hospitalization model, so he went in and he did some study of this and created some models for me, so I can plug into to my ensemble. And he also says that in the future there'll be better techniques. And he's also very supportive of, after we've seen what an ensemble can do, he's also very supportive of the idea of like a feedback that the model can give you to say whether you're right or not. So what he did, he gave me a models for hospitalization. Again, the models has to be related to probability of someone being hospitalized and the time they get hospitalized. The time, just like mortality, is very important. Otherwise, you cannot use it in an ensemble. Let me show you the models that he gave me. So he gave me models that by age differ the probability of hospitalization. There's high probability. This means if a person gets infected, what's the chance of them being hospitalized at all? So by age, he gave me a low probability, a high probability, and a moderate probability. But also he gave me the time according to the age in years, the hospitalization time, meaning when will the person be hospitalized. So apparently it varies. And all of those models can now go back in the ensemble, and the ensemble can actually calculate, yes, this is probably the average hospitalization rate according to all the data and all the sources and all the states and everything that I plugged in, all the assumptions and all the put in need. Because this can be informative later on, very high up in the government after all the information is collected. This is our average hospitalization rate. Of course, it varies and whatever, but at least gives them an idea of what's happening. And then if some places the rate is much higher, then they can figure out why. This is important information. So that's about it. I believe that my time is running out. So I just want to tell you that I have two more co-authors, actually three more. Filippo is also there. So Aviral and Christine, they did a paper, and I actually ask you to go there and check it out. They actually analyzed the CDC ensemble model, the one that was used on forecasting. The UMass actually did this model. And they analyzed it and figured out, you know what? Let's look at all of the models and see what's going on there. And they categorized and found an error. They also included two baseline models, and they found out that more than one third of the models failed to outperform a simple static case baseline. The information about the baseline is available in the paper. But two-thirds failed to outperform a simple linear trend forecast. So in the future, whenever you model, add those two baseline models and then compare. Okay, unfortunately I haven't done this in my ensemble. Perhaps in the future, but this I introduced to this work fairly recently. But this is something that you all should be aware of. If you're modeling, add those two baseline. They did a lot of marvels. Why? And they are very uncomplicated. So it's a very good farm rule. Um, and I cannot speak on their behalf too much. These are my words or my understanding of what they did, but you can read the actual words in the paper. Um, but they want to recommend some things for the government. First of all, they want to reassess the role of forecasting models in pandemic modeling and policy formulation. I actually say the same, but I say let models explain rather than forecast. If you cannot explain, how can you forecast? This is my words, not theirs. But they actually want to reassess it. Um, and and also there's a concern about directly hosting some of them, because if you say this is the CDC model, which kind of happened because the CDC put the UMass model on the website, then actually people looking at it, if it's the CDC model, then people trust it. And there might be a problem with this if we don't know everything about the models. So it's more important to inform people about the models. And you have to know the differences between those. Uh, Also, they want to say the current models are good enough perhaps to forecast the peak and decline. But if you want to, beforehand focus, meaning before the peak and decline, then you have to be more careful and be hands-on on the models and tweak them all the time. Uh, and they have recommendations for researchers. Main recommendation is use a 2 to 4 week interval, and which makes sense also from a hospital perspective because they have staffing issues and they can respond only in that interval. Um, this is I agree with them because I learned that when I dropped to 3 weeks, my results became much better. Expecting variations is to expect this. I'm going to stop now because I want some time for people to respond or say something. No one's saying anything. So expect variations, expect mutations to happen. Christine wrote this section. I highly recommend reading the paper. And then there's a whole list of information about how to disseminate the information to the public and computing infrastructure, centralized economical records, how to educate experts, how to explain emerging technologies, and educate the press, and then things related to research. Hopefully, we'll have another topic where we can actually another meeting where we can actually discuss those. I don't want to talk too much at this point because time is out, but I do hope that we'll have one more session that we can actually discuss those. I want your inputs, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's open the floor to questions. You've raised a lot of important points, so I hope people will ask and discuss.
The paper is currently en route to go to a journal. So if someone wants to add something from their experience, it's possible to join. But we'll have to redo things, come back, and so on. But like, if someone has things that we missed, please do tell us because we want it to be as comprehensive as possible.
I was going to make just a quick comment. It was more of a technical one. There were many things that you brought up, but one technical comment was I remember in that period working with students to try to do estimates for simple SIR-like models of rates of infection. And while the rates of new infection were recorded pretty well, in fact, a lot of the published data made a priori assumptions like somebody was infected or infectious for 2 weeks. And so because they logged people when they got recorded as ill or when they entered the hospital, but they didn't actually have any mechanism for determining when they left the hospital or when they stopped being infectious. And therefore, they just artificially assumed recovery time. And those recovery times then actually enormously affect the results of all of your other estimates of your R naught and infectivity and everything else. And so even though it looked like you had really nice data to fit, in fact, because you didn't actually have recovery information that was built in, you couldn't really get meaningful results, meaningful estimates for a lot of those parameters. And as you pointed out, Alan worked with people trying to estimate actual infectivity in individuals, but that required having an individual that you could observe and measure viral load over long times. It was expensive, it was intrusive, and so there was very little data available on how long you were really infectious. We had Chantal, of course, who was an expert on aerosols in our group at the time, looking at how things like temperature and humidity, airflow affected infectivity for individual encounters. And we had a talk by, and I'm sorry, I'm not remembering his name at the moment, an excellent talk where there was a very, very detailed, essentially agent-based model, which included airflow and everything else, trying to really model how individual virions got from one person when they coughed to another. And so there are all of these different scales that affect these kinds of questions.
I I totally agree. It's you're barging into an open door, but this information was not available. Alan Perlson was one of the first one. Actually, I had some very bad estimate at the beginning, and then Alan Perlson came up with this paper. I think his lead author was K. So I actually look at this and say, oh, now I have infectious curve. But even this, I had to actually go around and take it with like, take it from the paper, copy it, put some points, and then it stopped at 15 days. But I needed more. So it's like I had to estimate some things. And I'm telling you, we need those in the next pandemic at the beginning. And if the government has like this set of instructions what to do, and list all those things and everyone knows what they're doing, then it will be much, much better. And it's not that hard to do. It's just have like an envelope with all of those instructions somewhere in a drawer. The minute the pandemic starts, someone opens the drawer, takes this envelope, reads what we have to do, and that's it. But someone has to write them. This is the best I could write. If someone can improve it, please, please. It's an open door. The experiences you had, why aren't they written down?
I mean, the other thing that you mentioned that I remember from the beginning, right, was when especially the newspapers were trying to scrape excess mortality rates. They would be calling funeral homes and asking how many people died. Those were huge efforts, and as you point out, trying to get some kind of standardization of that was very difficult. Of course, if it's a novel pandemic, you may not know that those excess deaths are caused by the a new disease very early. And so it may take some time to actually be able to identify the signal as it was with the early period of the COVID epidemic.
So we knew that there was an epidemic. And I know, for example, China did publish those mortality rates also in a way that I couldn't use it, by the way. Those things are possible if we set our minds to it and find out if we have instructions and focus on what we should do. And knowing what I did now, I can go back and say, oh, this was missing. This appeared a year later. This 2 years later. This I learned 3 years later. All of those things can be compressed in time, so the next pandemic will not be as horrible as the one we had. And think about it, the amount of money and lives lost and grief because of the pandemic and economic, all of this can be squeezed and avoided if we just have a plan. And this is actually John Rice. He said, "Oh, why don't people train and stuff like this?" This is part of the next part that I haven't talked about it. But like, what if you had a reserve force, let's say, like in the military, that's like, oh, they get called only when there's a pandemic, and they always drill on they have like drills on fake pandemics all the time, and every once in a while they get called if there's a real pandemic, and they know what to do. They know how to collect the numbers, they know what to do, they have the computing power available, and so on and so forth. It's not that hard to do and doesn't even require that many resources. The waste that we had is because we didn't do it properly. I'm hoping we'll do it properly next time.
I think what you raised here is an excellent starting point for a discussion, and so I do hope we can have a discussion meeting to maybe you could give a 5 minute summary of what are the slide where your initial slide where you had your list of bullet points talking about the issues, and then we could have this one, yes. And I think that would be a great starting off point for people to have a discussion about some of these things.
Yeah. So the last red one we haven't discussed fully. I
Right.
actually almost didn't touch it, and this is something that I want to discuss because this has to do with how our research will be in the future. Perhaps if there will be IMAG officers there that actually take notes and the proposals will go in this direction, perhaps it will help.
Mine was more a comment than a question at this point because the only thing that I have to add that we should act on education now because in principle we have talked different times about having a task force of experts that constantly drill like firefighters, they are there all the times, but there is not a fire every day. So is how do we create that in the face of, I don't know, now is no more a priority for funding bodies and many others. How do we go about?
Very simple. So think about it. They're like, even in the military, it's not always at war, correct? Military is not always at war. Also, hackers are not always like doing, but they do all sorts of like tests every once in a while. So the military has like a reserve force. It convenes every once in a while, and they train on a regular basis. The training can be made on fake diseases. We come up, there's like an exercise. Here's a fake disease. Can you model it? So someone who created this fake disease and the numbers knows exactly what it is. Now, all of the modelers, and not only modelers, like the people who lose, now they have to practice how to track those numbers, how to get those things. And they have like, and they do it well, like once a year, 2 weeks a year, just to keep in shape, to know what's happening. And every once in a while, there's new software or whatever, so they learn something new. And it's not that much for a big government. And especially think about it, during the pandemic, there are people who don't do anything. Like the military probably was more concerned with the pandemic than other things. So some of the people, like in other parts that they do something else, they just get diverted to do that. So economically, it's possible to prepare it in a wise way that it will not continue resources, consume your resources. But then the next pandemic, you'll be more aware. But then again, this is the discussion that I wanted to do with you guys. Perhaps you have better ideas than me. This is what John suggested, like when we were sitting around. His name should be lead on this paper, but he wanted to be out. So I respected his wish. But John Rice actually can tell you how it's done in the military, and he'll tell you all sorts of how reserve forces work, how does it work, how is it funded. Those are things that are possible to do. A government who knows how to prepare for a future for things like this, it's doable. Question is whether it's a priority. But then again, if we do it smart, perhaps it doesn't cost much, though they don't care. Yeah, might as well do it. Because think, during a pandemic, there are people who stop doing other things. So, and you know that they'll stop doing this because they cannot do what they're usually doing. So perhaps divert them into this.
Rita, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the nice talk, Jacob. I am Brazilian, so I will ask you something that I was worried about Brazilian cities that are very heterogeneous in their way of life, in the sense that there are some parts of the cities that live just like in Europe or US, but there are some parts that are really communities and they cannot separate, they cannot live outside. And even if they live in two different home units, the units are not really separated. So, and it's not the case that you have one city like that and one city different. It's people will work in the wealthy city and come back there. So you have an interaction between these two populations. And I think this is an important thing to take into account when modeling, right?
When I modeled, I'm not modeling the interactions between the individuals themselves per se. I model statistically, because you cannot take into account every small thing, but you also have to look at the big picture eventually. In my case, I took all the states of the US as units, and even those that they are different, because there are some places like New York which have rural areas, and then there's the big hubs around New York. So I still have to take into account as much as possible some of the statistics I have. Now, I can tell you my modeling is not perfect, because you
No,
cannot explain everything. But if you take a large enough view from above, you can find out that yes, temperature does affect the pandemic. The transmission rate is around 2% and not like 70% like people think. Think about this says that the people were fearing. Each time you met a person, it was fear. So the reaction to the pandemic, in a sense, was psychological, in the sense, and like people thinking 70%. Most people I meet in the streets, like they give me numbers about 50% about the transmission rate. If we explained it from the beginning, transmission rate is low, but if you are infectious for many days, and therefore, and this is your infectious curve, and you're most infectious in day 5 after transmission. So if you go around and meet people, you're actually spreading the disease, and your chance to spread is about 2%. But then after you meet 100 people, eventually one of them will get it. Or if you have encounters, each one for 15 minutes, then people know how to perhaps behave better, perhaps make shorter encounters, and not fear.
Yeah.
The fear itself, the psychological impact on the economy as well was also, it's all throughout the world, because we didn't know. If we know, we're more informed. So yes, you cannot model everything, and there are some examples of a super spreader as a person who got everyone infected, but those are rare. Statistically, those things happen as well. So yes, you can model those things, and by the way, model those and put it as an ensemble. Put it against other assumptions and see whether this model behaves better or worse. This is why an ensemble is important.
Okay.
And ensembling techniques, however, are very rare today, still. Even though the computing power exists, the ideas exist, the methodology, I've been working on this for 10 years. Again, I have a conflict of interest. I have 2 patents on this technology. I want it to spread because I'll earn money from this. But still, not many people are doing it. And I just was in a conference in Belgium. They have disease maps. They haven't started using Ensemble for disease maps. They should. The ideas of the old technology, or here in our case, it's like statistical one is the SIR model, needs to be replaced by newer models. There's machine learning models. There's other statistical techniques, agent-based simulation, AI, whatever. It's time to get away from the old ones. And I still argue with academics. I had an argument this week, someone who actually did some good work. They are actually using an SIR model to extract parameters. Great. They are not focusing, they're extracting parameters. But they didn't see why. They see the agent-based or the simulation models that take a lot of computing power, something that's like out of reach. Is something different than what they're saying, because they're not used to this, because this is what the academics used to do for 100 years. So now you come with something new.
So I'm a PhD student from England. I just dropped in, and I love your talk because my PhD topic is about pandemic preparedness. Yes, and I loved at your section where you said that the ensemble model can't even beat a linear model. I feel this. Every time there's a change point, the CDCs, and the same with the European models and the English model, they overshoot every change point, every single time. And this is disastrous, right? They cannot beat a simple linear model. But here's the reason why they can't. Because none of these models integrate behavior. And behavior in a pandemic is a far bigger factor than the actual biology. So how do we do this? We have to, and that's what I'm doing in my PhD, we have to measure behavior. And it's basically what we have is we have individual level phone data. So quite sophisticated data that allows us to basically estimate the contact rate per person, per individual. And there comes the connection to a slide that you presented. You said that we need additional information about mobility. And you suggest the mobility metrics that we have from the big tech companies, number 4, yeah. The mobility indices we have from the big tech companies, but also surveys. Both of them are bad. And I'll tell you why they're bad. Because the mobility indices from Google or something are still population level metrics that don't capture the heterogeneity in behavior that happens, right? And that's something I can prove in my thesis, and it's hopefully soon in some papers to come. And the other thing is survey data was tried in the pandemic. For example, in England, we had, in parts of Europe, we had the COMIX, CACOMIX surveys. They have an inherent problem. That is, they are structured such that the participants in the survey are never the really high movers in society. A person who has 1,000 contacts per day does not have the time to fill out the survey at the end of the day. And if you look at the publications that come out, they systematically exclude people with more than 50 contacts from their summaries. They are so skewed towards the left-hand side of the distribution that they kind of become useless. So I want to advertise something. I want to advertise an additional source of data that is needed, and that's now available worldwide. And you can basically buy this kind of data. It's individual level mobility data because that allows you to model heterogeneity. What do you think of that?
I'm all for it. I'm not against any type of data. Please, not only advertise, contact me later, we'll talk. I actually, if you have ideas that are better for what it is, and by the way, by surveys, I didn't say surveys is like the census gave us household size. I didn't use survey data anywhere. I used number of encounters that came from 2 sources. One of them gave me an average, one gave me a standard deviation. This was a waste thing. I didn't have those numbers. If you can give me better numbers, please.
Yeah.
I'm all for it. I'm just putting it in an ensemble and see which numbers explain better what I see. And
I have
again,
I have another comment to make. Why there is no task force that simulates. First of all, there's a problem with simulating a fake. Yeah, because you don't have the behavior doing a simulation, right? So you can't war game really a pandemic. That's
bingo.
one thing. But the other thing is, I love your philosophy of there needs to be a change in methodology. And that's what I'm trying to do in my thesis. I'm trying to reinvent modern technologies that modern tech companies use every day, right? But that have not penetrated academia whatsoever. And then I go to a conference about pandemics, and I see all the people that were there for the last 20 years, they're still there. None of them have been fired. All their models failed. All their models cannot beat a standard linear model. All their forecasts continuously fail whenever there's a change point, and they're still there, they're still talking, they still have a position.
You fit the system. I'm operating outside the system. It's like people here know me. You haven't been here at the beginning, but there's quite a bit of tension here because I think differently, and I pay for it myself. Like the only way for me to get back is for my ideas to come through, and this is why I have patents, and these are limited in time as well. So because it seems that you are stumbling across the same things that really people stumbled, and some of the things you're saying, it's like this paper was established because I added multiple people who think more or less the same like me. If you have other ideas that we haven't discussed, perhaps you want to join. I don't know. We'll have to talk. We'll see what can be done. But talk to me more. And the idea was here to have a discussion. And we haven't finished everything. The parts that you're saying about drills or whatever and about behavior and so on are in the future. But for the encounter frequency, the most important thing they didn't do is the local jurisdictional restrictions in one central place. This is major. The governments should do this. All governments.
So I'm looking at that's the problem everywhere. Like Germany, for example, my home country, is a federal state, and it's just aggregating what each federal state is doing is a nightmare. It's impossible.
It's possible.
It needs to be done, but it's next to.
It's very easy. Today you can write with an AI software that will put a web page that each place will do this, and by law they have to go and do this, and it will take you here. Write the code in Cursor for 15 minutes or for an hour, and you have this website, and then put it up, and then you now have to push your parliaments to pass it as a law. And those things take time. Here, for example, clinicaltrials.gov is today, every clinical trial has by law to be written there. You know how much time it took them to actually, since they started the website, there was the US government decided that this should be, so every clinical trial should be recorded. Before it didn't exist. It took them, started their website, and then only in 2017, I think like 5 or something years after, only then the law kicked in, and only then they started reporting results. Those things take time, but we better start doing them now so the governments will know, the people who create the laws, the people who do the research, all know how to do this, so the next pandemic will be easier.
Okay, well, that was a great conversation. Is there a last question from our audience? Clearly, this is a topic that deserves more discussion, especially, I think, on the additional points you raised about data sharing and data aggregation, also about communication and preparation, education. These are all things that should be discussed. I think we could have a great discussion about that. Thank you to everybody for joining, and I appreciate people's willingness to stay. And I will see people in about a month at this point. Thanks, everyone. Bye.